Oh, that sounds so nice. Thank you so much. That is really way too kind. Thank you. How's everybody doing today?
Great.
I am doing great too. I'm actually really excited. Today we're talking about what is probably my favorite topic in all of Photoshop, maybe even in all of digital imaging, in large part because I'm a control freak, for those of you who don't know me, and I never feel like I'm finished with a photo. Whenever I look at a picture, months after I've worked on it, I say, I could have also done this other thing. And my general approach to optimizing photos, I sort of describe this as starting with the biggest problem first and kind of working down from there, even though, of course, as any of you who've seen my photos know, there are no problems with any of my pictures. I just use that as a sort of a term of endearment, as it were. But start with, sort of the biggest adjustment. And generally speaking, I start with the global adjustments, meaning I start off with the adjustments that are affecting the entire image, generally speaking, and then work my way down to the more detailed and detailed and detailed adjustments. And I think, detail really is an important word there because it's that attention to detail that enables us to find all the various issues with our photos and hopefully to improve upon any issues that we can find with our photos. So, without further ado, let's talk about my top 10 tips for targeted adjustments in Photoshop. So targeted adjustments, Photoshop in general, but especially targeted adjustments, layer masks, there's a little bit of a reputation as being maybe not so easy to learn or easy to use. I'm going to try and kind of dispel that today. So tip number 1, understand selections, layer masks, and alpha channels. How many of you, your eyes are glazing over already? Right? So let's not. Just don't believe the hype. So there's a lot for sure that's going on when we're talking about layer masking in Photoshop, and it seems on the surface really complicated. It's actually pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Let's take a look. We have a picture. We decide there's something we would like to change about that picture that is not global, that is specific to a particular area of the image. For example, in this case, maybe I want to apply some adjustments that only affect the bald eagle and that don't affect the background in the image. How am I going to tell Photoshop what I want to have affecting the image in certain areas and not in other areas? Well, someday, I will just say, "Oh, Photoshop, do you see the bird?" It will answer yes. "Can you please make the bird feather detail a little bit brighter and a little bit sharper?"
Sure.
"Yes, Tim, I'll get right on that." Actually, by the time the sentence is even finished, it will already... Isn't this going to be a really cool thing someday? In the meantime, until all that, voice recognition technology gets to where we need it, we need some way of saying, "Hey, Photoshop, this is what I want to change in this photo. This is the area." Well, how might we go about that? Pretty straightforward. I'm going to make a new layer here, just because. And I'm just going to use, I feel like white will be the areas that I want to affect. And so I'm just going to say, "Hey, Photoshop, you see this area? This is the area that I want you to affect with the adjustment that I'm about to show you." Of course, as I draw carefully over the bald eagle, you realize why I took up photography rather than painting. But that's a different story. And so we've identified this is the area that I want you to adjust. I want more shadow detail. I want more sharpness, whatever the case. We're not worried about what that adjustment might be right now. It's just, "Hey, Photoshop, this is where I want the impact to show up in the photo." And then we can take a look at other areas. What's the rest of the picture? Well, "Hey, Photoshop, this is the stuff that I don't want you to touch. These are the areas that should not be affected by the adjustment that I'm about to apply to this image." I will now spend the next 10 minutes perfecting this masterpiece painting for you. No, not really. But that gives you the basic idea, right? Isn't that easy? That's so simple. Agreed?
Yes.
Good. That's very simple. And yet, many photographers get confused by the notion of selections, layer masks, alpha channels, and any of a number of other assorted things that we can use to try to confuse ourselves in Photoshop. This is easy. Well, guess what? This is exactly how Photoshop thinks. This is exactly how Photoshop keeps track of which areas of the image are being adjusted and which areas of the image are not being adjusted, of which areas of the image are selected versus which areas of the image are not selected. So if I make a selection, we'll just go ahead, I'll just make a really quick rough selection here. And I'm going to turn off my little black and white layer. There's a selection based on the black and white image that I just drew. Areas that were white are selected, areas that were black are deselected or are not selected. But really, Photoshop in the background is thinking about that selection exactly like that black and white little painting that I just drew. And if I were to use that selection, for example, to apply a targeted adjustment, I'll just make a dramatic curves adjustment here so that we can see enhanced contrast, for example. Obviously a horrible adjustment in this case. But that adjustment, hopefully you can see, is only affecting, I'll make it even more dramatic here, is only affecting the eagle and not the background. So I'm applying an adjustment that's only affecting that area that I had painted in originally. Well, we can get very fancy and try to come up with terms that help us to remind ourselves of how these things work. I usually use black blocks and white reveals. So in the context of a layer mask, which it happens to be what we're looking at the moment, black blocks and white reveals. Any areas where the layer mask is black, the adjustment is blocked, is not visible. Any areas where the layer mask is white are revealed. So in the context of a layer mask, black blocks and white reveals. But again, it's just sort of like a stencil that Photoshop is using to identify specific areas of the image. Do you need a selection again? Okay, no problem. I'll turn off the adjustment and we can get back to our selection. Oh, what if you're in quick mask mode? Maybe you've used quick mask mode because when it comes to selections, you prefer to paint rather than trace. No problem. In quick mask mode, guess what? If we take a look at the channels panel, you'll see that there is a quick mask alpha channel right now. That's just Photoshop's way of remembering the shape of that selection. So there are all sorts of different ways that Photoshop can present a selection or a layer mask. We've seen a few examples already. We've got the marching ants display, that animated dashed line that outlines wherever it was that I had, in this case, painted white around the eagle in this case. Or I can use quick mask mode so that I get this red overlay indicating areas that are not selected versus no overlay on areas that are selected. I can go to the channels panel and in quick mask mode I see the quick mask alpha channel. Or because I have added a layer mask via an adjustment layer, I can see the actual mask. It is an alpha channel on the channels panel. All these fancy words, but it's just Photoshop's stencil. It can be presented as this animated line, as this red overlay, as a black and white image, as a thumbnail for a layer mask on the layers panel. It can be presented as all sorts of things, but really, it's just a stencil. That's easy. So our job, when it comes to applying targeted adjustments within Photoshop, is to define the stencil, and then to define the adjustment. It is so simple. It is so simple. And we're only on tip number 1. Tip number 2 is, when possible, skip the mask. Now, I have a variety of interesting, how would you describe like psychological problems without them sounding quite so bad? Like behavioral quirks. Yeah, quirks. I'm a control freak, but I'm also really lazy. So if I don't have to do all the work, I'd rather not. So let's take a look at an example of that. And the idea here is to bear in mind that in many situations, there are adjustments that you can apply where you might initially think you need to have a layer mask, and you think that you have to define this very specific area very carefully in the image, but in fact you don't. One of the most common things I hear when it comes to layer masking is, how do I fix the sky? Right, we always want to fix the sky. Sometimes we just want to replace it altogether. Let's put a different sky. I'll take a picture on a sunny day, and we'll put it into the picture taken on a cloudy day, or vice versa, whatever the case may be. Or if we're talking about just adjustments as opposed to actually replacing pixels and totally faking the photo, basically, it might be just darkening down the sky, or improving the saturation in the sky, or making it more cobalt rather than cyan. Or maybe I want that red barn to be a green barn, or a yellow barn, or whatever the case may be. When it comes to color adjustments, or adjustments that are defined based on specific color values in the photo, you can actually, in many cases, accomplish everything you need with a simple hue saturation adjustment layer with no need to define a selection or to define a layer mask, etc. So let's basically completely destroy this photo in the process of demonstrating some of the things that might be possible. We'll start off with a more straightforward adjustment, a more realistic adjustment, I suppose. We want to adjust the sky. We want the sky to be a little bit darker, a little bit more saturated, a little more blue rather than cyan. Well, hue saturation at first glance doesn't really give you that capability. If we go to the hue slider, for example, that is interesting. That's interesting. But in the context of photographic images, interesting is not always good. And so as I move that slider for hue, you're probably very quickly going to say, okay, obviously the hue slider is not for me. Saturation, that's the make the colors look all better slider, or make the colors disappear slider. But here again, we're affecting the entire image. And then lightness, I like to describe this as pour a bunch of white paint on the image or a bunch of black paint on the image. If you use it at a relatively modest value even, you can see we're sort of just muddying up the picture. Not a very good adjustment at all. All things considered, it does have its place. But as you can see, at first glance, it's reasonable to assume that hue saturation really not that helpful, except for maybe very minor increases in saturation. A little self-control goes a long way there. But what you might not have known is that with the hue saturation adjustment, we also have the ability to apply adjustments to specific color channels, in the image. This is pretty cool. So let's say, just as a starting point, so we get an obvious change in the image, I want to adjust the appearance of the wheat field in the foreground. Wheat, of course, is green, so I'm going to choose the greens pop-up. It's not labeled here, this pop-up. It's the channel pop-up, but it's not actually labeled as such. So the default value is master, meaning work on the entire image. We can choose a specific color channel. I'll choose greens. And then let's just say, for argument's sake, that I just want to make the wheat field appear entirely gray. I just want a black and white wheat field. And so I've reduced the saturation entirely. And as you can see, this has caused the wheat field now to become completely desaturated, just shades of gray, completely black and white, with absolutely no color in the wheat field. See, now that's especially embarrassing because this is being recorded. And soon this is going to be on YouTube, and people are going to be watching this. And now I'm nervous, and I got to quickly try and figure out how to fix this. Fortunately, I've done this before. So what's the problem here? First off, let's get one thing straight. Those of you in the live studio audience, whose fault is this? The fact that the greens did not desaturate, whose fault is it? Photoshop, thank you. That's the right answer. Was anyone thinking it was my fault?
No. Computer's fault.
Thank you. No, clearly it's Photoshop's fault. It couldn't possibly be my fault. What's the real problem here? Basically, Photoshop and I are having a little bit of a disagreement. We don't agree on what green is, basically. I think I have a pretty good idea of green. Photoshop has a different idea. Actually, in this case, as is very often the case actually, foliage in the real world, usually a bit more yellow than it is green. So I would have been better off choosing the yellows pop-up there, the yellows channel, so that I could desaturate the yellows. But what if I actually did have it? Presumably, if we look closely, there probably is some green in the wheat, I hope, or some colors that Photoshop has decided are green. Well, I can actually change the very definition of green. And in fact, if you take a look at the bottom or toward the bottom of the properties panel, you'll see a couple of colored gradients, so a couple of rainbow gradients. Those are the before and after color values, previews as it were. So that top gradient is showing me the range of colors that are available in my photo. It's just the full rainbow of possible colors. And the bottom is intended to be the after view. So you might notice if I shift the hue slider around, the two gradients there will kind of shift around a little bit. In this case, if you look closely, you'll see that the bottom gradient in the greens, it shows gray, meaning that we've desaturated the greens. The only problem is it's not really the greens that I was trying to desaturate. Well, if you look even closer, you'll see that there are a couple of vertical bars there that define the range of colors that we're currently working on. The little vertical bars indicate the range of colors that will be completely affected by the adjustment, in this case being completely desaturated. And then to the outside, the little trapezoid shapes that indicate the degree of feathering, or the transition between colors that are being affected versus not affected by my adjustment. So in this case, I need to expand that range to include the yellows. So if I point my mouse in between the vertical bar and that little trapezoid, that feathering indicator out toward the left of it, I can actually expand that range of colors. And as I do, you'll start to see that the yellows start to shift. And as I go further and further, the reds start to shift. Again, in this case, with a desaturation adjustment. And I could actually expand this range of colors to include essentially every single color in the image if I really wanted to. But usually, obviously, I'm actually just going to focus on a specific range. Note, by the way, that my first step really, besides choosing a particular color channel, was to completely desaturate. I wanted a very obvious adjustment so that now, while I'm fine-tuning that range of colors that I'm actually impacting, I can see where I'm having an effect in the image. I know when I've dragged too far and have gotten into the reds, or when I've dragged not quite far enough and I still have some of the yellows showing. So I'll apply that exaggerated adjustment. In almost all cases, I'll completely desaturate. Sometimes you might want to go the other direction and completely saturate. But the point being is I want a very obvious adjustment so that as I play with this range of colors, I'm able to see the actual effect in the photo, that change as I expand or contract the range of colors. So I will drag just a bit further over toward the left, and I want to try and find an absolute perfect range. I can adjust the degree of feathering or transition by moving that trapezoid in or out as needed. I can adjust the vertical bar independent of that trapezoid. I can drag both of them together by clicking and dragging in between the two. I can even drag the center point here to change the focus, the central range of colors being affected. So I'll go ahead and fine-tune that just a little bit. And again, you can see that I'm having an effect in a specific area of the photo, but I did not need to use a layer mask because I was able to define a range of colors in the image that I would like to have an effect on. Now, obviously, this is limited to some extent. I'll go ahead and bring up the saturation slider. If I wanted to make the wheat gray, this is very effective. I'm not sure there's ever been a situation where I wanted to do that to a wheat field and not to the rest of the image. I might want to increase the saturation for the wheat field a little. I might want to shift the color value for that wheat field. Now, obviously, we can do some really weird and wild things here, but in the real world, in most situations, it would be just a matter of fine-tuning. So taking the field that looked maybe just a little too yellow and shifting it a little bit more toward green, or something that was a little too cyan and shifting it back toward a more natural green look, or whatever the case may be. But the point is that we're able to apply these color adjustments. We're a little limited. I can't increase contrast very effectively right now because I'm really just affecting the overall color properties, the hue, saturation, and lightness of a specific range of colors. But that said, there are many, many situations where this is exactly the type of thing I need. I'll go ahead and switch to the cyans, for example. And I'll just kind of darken down and increase saturation and maybe shift that toward a more kind of cobalt-ish type of sky. Obviously a dramatic, over-exaggerated effect here, but it gives you that concept in terms of being able to adjust colors in the image based on specific color ranges. A word of caution though, you might notice, I'll go ahead and crank up the saturation here. Actually, we'll switch back to the greens, which is now the yellows too, since I expanded it so far. And I'm going to oversaturate those yellows, the yellow and green range that I was just working with. At first glance, you would say, oh, the greens, I mean yellows, that will only affect the wheat field. Except I made the mistake of being up at first light, and so now we've got lots of golden light illuminating the barn as well, and so you'll see that there's a fair amount of yellow, and as I shift that saturation up and down, you can see kind of the roof of the barn lighting up a little bit. And so one of the key things here to keep in mind is that when we're adjusting an image based on color values, that means based on anywhere in the image that color value appears. So while this can be much easier in many cases compared to creating a layer mask, it also has some shortcomings where it could potentially cause problems, and more importantly, could cause a problem that you're not aware of. If you're not paying careful attention, you might not see that the roof looks a little weird until after you print the image, and that obviously can be a bit frustrating. So in some cases, you can completely bypass the need to create a layer mask when you're applying a targeted adjustment. In other cases, you can't, but in situations where it actually will work, it can be a tremendous benefit in terms of being easier to implement and in terms of streamlining the process, making it that much faster. So the key point is to bear in mind that in many cases you can apply targeted adjustments without the use of a layer mask, and as much as I love layer masks, I also love skipping out on some of the work whenever possible. Number 3, dodge and burn smartly. How many of you have ever worked in the wet darkroom, black and white, wet darkroom? Do you miss the smell? No. It sure was fun though, right? Until it came time that you were happy with one of your prints and you wanted to make a bigger version of the exact same thing. And now you got to remember how you did all your dodging and burning. You know, is it dodging over here for 3 seconds and moving this thing, and I got my cardboard cut out, but now I need a bigger version of it. So one of the advantages of digital, one of the many advantages I would say of digital, is that when we apply an effect such as dodging and burning, we're actually able to reproduce that effect repeatedly. We can keep printing the image over and over and over again, and it always looks the same, which was not so easy to do in the wet darkroom. There are a variety of ways that you might dodge and burn. Dodging and burning, put simply, is just lightening and darkening specific areas of the photo. Pretty straightforward. One of the reasons that I think it's kind of cool and fun is that it gives you an opportunity to be, dare I say, a little bit more artistic in the digital darkroom compared to the wet darkroom. You literally were getting your hands dirty, or at least wet, working directly, manipulating the photo itself, really touching it and doing things with it. Whereas in the digital darkroom, not so much. You're sliding things around, you're just touching a mouse. It's not quite as interesting. With dodging and burning, we actually have the opportunity to paint with light or dark, to lighten and darken specific areas of the photo, which I think is pretty cool. We could employ a layer mask combined with a curves adjustment layer to lighten up certain areas and another curves adjustment layer to darken up certain areas. But to me, those sorts of approaches are just more convoluted than they need to be. And usually, when I'm thinking of dodging and burning, I'm not thinking first about lightening up shadow detail and then about darkening down highlight detail. I'm thinking of an overall process of lightening and darkening selectively throughout the photo. So I'm going to show you the approach that I use for dodging and burning in my photos. First off, I endorse and follow a completely non-destructive approach to working in Photoshop, which means I'm always working either with an adjustment layer or some other pixel layer or some other magical technique so that I'm not harming the original pixels in my image. I can always come back to that underlying background image layer, for example, or in extreme situations, I can go back to my original raw capture and re-render with different settings. But the point is that I want to use layers whenever possible just to preserve flexibility. And mostly, yes, of course, it's non-destructive. There's a variety of potential quality benefits. Really, it comes back to me just being a control freak. I want to always be able to go back and fine-tune some of the work that I had done previously. So I'm going to make a new layer because I want this non-destructive workflow. But it's going to be a pixel-based layer, not an adjustment layer, just because of the nature of what I'm about to do. But I don't want just any layer. I want a very special layer. So instead of simply clicking on the blank sheet of paper icon, the Create a New Layer button at the bottom of the Layers panel, I'm going to hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh while I click on that button. Because I was holding the Alt or Option key, instead of just getting a new empty layer, I'm going to get a dialog asking what settings I would like to use for this layer. So, First off, a name for the layer. Very helpful so that I don't forget later, wait, why did I add that particular layer? So what should we call this one? Dodge and burn. Very unoriginal, but predictable, and perfectly suitable because that is what the layer is there for after all. What else do we need to change? The blend mode. The default is normal. I don't want a normal layer. I want a special, magical, amazing, wonderful dodge and burn layer. And so I'm going to use a blend mode that allows me to enhance contrast in the image. That's essentially what dodging and burning is, right? It's increasing contrast, lightening up some areas, darkening down other areas. So I'm going to use one of the contrast blend modes. Specifically, I'm going to use overlay. If you hear someone else talking about this technique, you might hear them referencing the soft light blend mode. Perfectly fine. Soft light produces the same basic effect, just with a little more subtlety. I'm not really big on subtlety, so I go for overlay. Also overlay, because it is a little bit stronger, it gives me a greater range of adjustments. Frankly, that's not necessary because we're going to be using a very modest degree of adjustment in any event, but the point is that both overlay and soft light, perfectly fine. If for some reason you just have an affinity for the term soft light rather than overlay, just be aware you're probably going to have to increase the intensity of the effect, which we'll see in just a moment. So I'm going to choose overlay. I also like to turn on this checkbox, fill with overlay neutral color, 50% gray. What that means is that we'll be filling with 50% gray, middle gray, and that 50% gray is the neutral color when it comes to the overlay blend mode. That's a lot of information to pack into a single checkbox, so I give Adobe at least some credit for making it as simple as they possibly could have. Mostly it means make it easier for me to see what's going on with this layer, and I'll show you what I mean by that shortly. All right, so I've given it a name, totally optional, but highly recommended and I think very helpful. I've changed the blend mode to overlay, pretty important. Again, you could use soft light if you prefer. And I've turned on the checkbox, optional, but helpful, as you'll see. I'll go ahead and click OK to create that new layer. And you can see, sure enough, on the Layers panel, I have a brand new layer called Dodge and Burn. You can see from the thumbnail that it's filled with 50% gray, with middle gray. And you can see that the pop-up toward the top left of the Layers panel indicates that the blend mode is set to overlay. And you can see that we have so far had absolutely no impact whatsoever on the photo itself. And the reason for that is that 50% gray is the neutral color for the overlay blend mode. There really are gray pixels on that layer, and they really are having absolutely positively no impact whatsoever on the photo. How are we going to change that? Well, we're going to paint with light or dark. So we'll press the letter D on the keyboard to set the colors to their default value. So if you take a look at the bottom of my toolbar, you can see that we have black as the foreground color and white as the background color. I'll go ahead and press the letter B as in brush on the keyboard, or I could choose the brush tool from the toolbox. And then we'll take a look at the options bar up toward the top below the menu bar, where we can adjust the settings for our brush. So we have a mode pop-up. Oh yes, blend mode, I remember that. We chose overlay, or we might have chosen soft light. This is set to normal. That's okay. All the magic is happening with the layer. The layer itself is set to the overlay blend mode. The brush is set to the normal blend mode, and that's exactly what I want. Opacity, we'll come back to that one. And then we have some other settings here, one related to the use of a tablet, like a Wacom tablet. And we've got a flow setting, which is related to the airbrush type of effect, which I call the unpredictability feature. And I don't like unpredictability, so I leave the airbrush feature turned off, and the flow becomes irrelevant. So now, if we come down into the image, I can paint with black or white. Now this is similar conceptually to the layer mask, but again, we're not yet using a layer mask. We're bypassing the need for a layer mask by using a blend mode to create an interesting effect, a lightening or darkening effect. So if I paint with black, I will darken. And if I paint with white, I will brighten. In this case, a lot. Talk about dodging and burning. Because I have painted with black and white. Well, if black darkens way too much, and white lightens way too much, and middle gray has no effect whatsoever, it's not too difficult to figure out what lies in between. We need some shades of gray. Well, the way that I accomplish that is actually just to reduce the opacity for the brush itself. Generally speaking, I'll work at an opacity somewhere between around about 10% on the low end, because below that you can hardly see the effect at all, and up to maybe about 20% on the high end. Bearing in mind, of course, that I could paint over the same area over and over again if I want to build up an effect. So for our purposes, I'll go toward that higher limit. I'm going to set the opacity up on the options bar to 20%. You can just press the number 2 on the keyboard, by the way, to accomplish that when you're working with the brush tool. Number 1 will give you 10%, the number 2 will give you 20%, a quick 1-5 will give you 15%. So I've just pressed the number 2, and then the letter X, as in exchange, will allow you to swap the foreground and background colors, making this process incredibly easy. And then finally, we can adjust the size of the brush as needed using the left and right square bracket keys. The left square bracket key will reduce the brush size, and the right square bracket key will increase the brush size. Pretty straightforward. Obviously, a few things that we need to establish in terms of settings. You could save those settings as a preset to make your work a little bit easier. But the point is that we're just painting with black and white at a reduced opacity and using that overlay blend mode so that that painting is lightening or darkening specific areas of the image. And so really all I need to do as I'm working is adjust the size of the brush as needed and adjust the colors, usually switching between black and white. I'll also make sure that I'm working with a soft-edged brush. If I click the little brush pop-up here, you can see my hardness is set to 0%, and I, generally speaking, always use a 0% hardness when I'm dodging and burning because I want the effect to blend in very smoothly with the surrounding areas. Pretty straightforward. The only other thing to keep in mind, remember I mentioned that we could paint over the same area multiple times to build up a stronger effect. Well, how does Photoshop know whether or not we're painting over the same area multiple times? It knows that when we let go of the mouse button. And so, just for illustrative purposes, I'll go ahead and click. I'm painting with black, and so I'm darkening. And I'm just going to swirl my mouse around. I'm holding the mouse button down the entire time. I can do this for like the next 10 minutes, and we'll see no increased darkening effect. I have sort of a fixed effect. But as soon as I release the mouse and then click again, now I have an additional darkening effect. The reason it's important to keep that in mind is that if, for example, I were trying to lighten up just the lion's face, for example, I would want to make sure that I paint over the entirety of the face before I let go so that I have an even effect. So I might, for example, darken up the edges. And again, I'm using a 20% opacity here, so this is a little bit stronger than I normally would, but it makes it easier for us to see here today. Maybe I'll switch to white and I'll brighten up the face a little bit and brighten up the mouth a little bit, and maybe I'll reduce that brush size and darken down the edges of the mane or whatever other things I could think of to do. The idea is I'm lightening and darkening in specific areas here, darkening the edges a little bit, kind of getting a vignette effect, opening up detail in the face of the lion, whatever else I decide I would like to accomplish for the photo. I can turn off the visibility for that layer, and you can see while I was painting, it didn't seem to be a very dramatic effect. But now when I turn it off and on again, it seems pretty dramatic. And that's sort of, to me, one of the important things when it comes to dodging and burning. No one should look over your shoulder or look at a print on the wall and say, oh, I see you've been dodging and burning. Rather, they should say, wow, that is a striking photo. Or, wow, you must have been scared taking that picture. Or whatever the reaction was, but not, I see you're learning to use Photoshop. Now, I mentioned the shades of gray, that I filled this new layer with 50% gray. That was totally optional, but it makes it much easier to see where I've been working in the image. Well, if I turn off my underlying image, I can see that layer. That works pretty well. Let me show you what it would have looked like. I'll turn off that layer, and we'll make yet another layer right there. And now I'll paint, once again, at a 20% opacity, which is pretty strong. I'll paint some black and white streaks. You can kind of make them out, especially the black streak. The white streak's pretty tricky to see. You could if you really worked at it, but who wants to work at it? Not me, said the lazy photographer. And so I would much rather be able to just look right at that layer, just turn off my image layer, have a look, and it's very easy to see. Because I have that middle gray background, I can see areas that are light versus dark compared to what I started with. But most importantly, of course, is I'll evaluate the image itself. So that, once again, is a technique that bypasses the need for a layer mask in order to apply a targeted adjustment to specific areas of the photo. Tip number 4 for targeted adjustments has nothing to do with targeted adjustments. Well, not really. But practice. One of the things that I find photographers struggle with when it comes to layer masking and targeted adjustments is not understanding the core concepts. Now, hopefully that first image that we took a look at makes it much easier for you to understand the basic concepts involved with layer masking. It's so much easier when we just think of it as a stencil. At least I hope you find it much easier to think of in the context of just having a basic stencil for where should the adjustment affect the image. But it's not quite as tangible. And so if you're just getting started with layer masking in Photoshop with targeted adjustments, I strongly recommend that you play around with creating composite images, even if you have no interest in creating composite images at all. It will help you get a better sense for the various concepts involved with creating layer masks. So, for example, we're going to create, in this case, a very realistic scene, a totally believable composite image. We're going to take this canola field under a cloudy sky, and we're going to replace that sky with this one. Because why not? You might as well have a little fun while you're learning, right? Or did somebody actually believe that was going to be totally believable? Nobody? We'll check the phone and see what they say. So I have these 2 layers. I've blended 2 layers together into a single document that has, in this case, 2 layers. My canola field layer and my hot air balloons layer. Well, layer masking, we've already learned the concepts. We already know what to do, right? We just need to make a stencil. And what does that stencil look like? Black blocks and white reveals. Okay, well right now, what's revealed? The canola field. Why is it the canola field that gets to be revealed? Why isn't it the hot air balloons? Because the hot air balloon layer is hiding underneath the canola field layer. If you take a look at our layers panel, think of them as 2 4x6-inch prints. They're sitting one on top of the other. The one on top is seen, the one below is not. So we essentially need to take some scissors, right? Except we're going to be totally non-destructive in our workflow, so we're not going to start cutting up our 4x6 prints to glue them together and make a composite. We're going to use the magic of Photoshop to sort of simulate that process and come out with the same image as a result. So the first step in this case, I have this topmost layer is a layer I'm going to work with. I need to make a stencil. And on that stencil, black blocks and white reveals. Well, let's start off by making a blank stencil. So with my image layer, in this case the canola field layer, the topmost layer selected, I can select it just by clicking on the thumbnail on the layers panel. I'm going to click on the Add Layer Mask button. That's that circle inside of a square icon down at the bottom of the layers panel. That will add a layer mask to the currently active image layer. So now I have a layer mask that is accomplishing absolutely nothing so far. Because it's a blank layer mask, you might say, or it's a default layer mask. That layer mask, as you can see from the thumbnail, is filled with white. In the context of a layer mask, black blocks and white reveals. In the context of a photographic image, reveal means show me the picture. And block means hide the picture. Well, if I hide parts of my canola field image layer, what will magically appear? Whatever's underneath. That could be absolutely nothing. But in this case, it happens to be a hot air balloon layer. And so if I change my layer mask to be a stencil for the sky, I get to magically see hot air balloons instead of a cloudy sky. Don't worry too much about the particular details of how I'm accomplishing it. Just understand the concepts, which will make much more sense as we proceed with the various other tips today. But I am creating a stencil. Obviously, in the interest of time, I am doing a really bad job defining that stencil. But you get the idea here. We'll kind of do a minor little cleanup job so it's not quite as embarrassing for me. but something like that. Obviously, if I spent an extra 12 seconds making that even better, it would be wonderful and, more importantly, very realistic as a photographic image. So other than that really bad mask, we have a basic composite. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the layer mask itself. There's our stencil. There is our stencil, black blocks, white reveals. What do I want to see? We'll call it the bottom 2/3 roughly. What do I not want to see? The upper third. As a result of blocking or revealing portions of my canola field layer, what do I see? I don't know. What's underneath this image? So I'm blocking or revealing pixels, and in the process, showing whatever happens to be underneath. I could block pixels right here and find more hot air balloons. Wow, let's go find some more hot air balloons. I love hot air balloons. But obviously, this underscores the point of accuracy in layer masks. There's much to be said for that. All right. But again, we're just simply defining that stencil. What should be visible versus not. And here, it's very tangible. It's almost tactile. I see a very clear effect. It's like I'm taking two photos and merging them together. Very easy to understand. We don't have all this confusion about now I'm adding a curves adjustment layer and a hue saturation adjustment layer, and things start to get a little bit messy. So as you're first getting started, play around with composite images. Even if you're not really interested in actually assembling composite images, use it as a little bit of practice. Then you can, have some fun. Look, the hot air balloons are rising. And I know the reaction that all of you are probably having is, it looks so realistic, until we get to the bottom of the photo, and it becomes less realistic. But up until then, it was totally realistic, right? That's where you agree and cheer loudly. Yeah. No, we don't agree. It's a horrible composite image, but it's fun to make. And more importantly, it will really help you get a better sense of how these various techniques and tools work when it comes to applying targeted adjustments, because it just makes it that much easier, I think, to actually understand the concepts related to targeted adjustments or layer masking in general. You guys want to look at the hot air balloon picture a little more? No, you're ready to move on. Okay, me too. Number 5. Start with simple painting and gradients. And the best part of this is that we've actually already sort of done some of that. I was just painting on my beautiful, amazing hot air balloons over the canola field composite, and we can do the exact same thing when it comes to applying targeted adjustments. But I do have a few recommendations in terms of how you actually implement that workflow. So let's take a look at that. Say goodbye to the amazing hot air balloons over the canola field. I know it's sad. Or is that only for me? No. Pardon me?
Those dragons on top of the building?
No, those are not dragons. Those are statues of winged, I suppose they're angels on chariots with horses and stuff. That's the monument to Vittorio Emanuele, credited with unifying Italy, essentially making it the country it is today. And yes, this is Rome. But more importantly, it's a picture with the sky in it. And we're going to adjust the sky in a very simple way. And again, a few little things that I recommend as far as workflow steps to help make things easier. Some of this we've already seen or at least hinted at with some of the other things we've talked about so far today. We're going to start off by applying an adjustment. So my aim here is to apply some sort of adjustment to the sky, whatever that might be. Let's just assume that I want to enhance contrast in the sky. The first tip, we'll start off just adding an adjustment layer. So let's go ahead and add a curves adjustment layer. I'll click on the half black, half white circle icon, the add adjustment layer icon, down at the bottom of the layers panel. And then from the pop-up menu that appears, I'm going to choose curves. You can choose anything. Well, any adjustment that represents an adjustment you want to have on a particular area of the photo anyway. I'm just going to use curves as an illustrative example here. And then the next tip, once we've gotten started, is to apply an exaggerated adjustment. You'll remember with the hue saturation trick, I completely desaturated once I chose a particular color channel so that I could see more clearly which areas of the photo were being affected. I'm going to do the same thing here. Whatever your adjustment was, just make it dramatic. There, now we have contrast in the sky and everywhere else in the photo as well. But more importantly, I can see exactly where I'm impacting the photo. Everywhere. I could have figured that out all on my own without even looking at the picture. I could look up at the layer mask. Oh yes, the adjustment layer came with a layer mask automatically. I didn't have to click the extra button. So if you've been thinking to yourself, someday I want to get into targeted adjustments and I want to learn about this whole layer masking thing, every time you add an adjustment layer in Photoshop, you're already using an adjustment layer. You're just not editing that layer mask. You're leaving it alone. So you're already using layer masks if you're using adjustment layers. But again, black blocks, white reveals. You can help solidify those concepts by working with composite images, but you can also help solidify the concept by applying really exaggerated adjustments so that it's very obvious. But the basic concept remains exactly the same. Black blocks, white reveals. Well, here's another little twist that I recommend, that I personally find makes it easier or more enjoyable or more comfortable or more something, and it's an approach that I recommend. Instead of blocking the adjustment from specific areas of the image, my preference is to reveal the adjustment in specific areas of the image. It doesn't really matter because I'm hopefully going to end up at the exact same destination regardless, but the point is that I just prefer to paint the adjustment in rather than blocking it. Call it another one of my, what did we call them? Quirks. Yes. So what I want to do is actually start off with an inverted mask. I want my mask to be black instead of white. I could paint the whole thing black and start over again, but I'm just going to use one of a few techniques. I'll tell you a couple of different ways you can do this, depending, are you more of a menu person? Then go up to the Edit menu and choose Fill, and there you can choose any color you'd like, for example, black, which would be the opposite of white. There's actually a keyboard shortcut to fill with black or white, so you can take a look at your foreground and background colors. On Windows, you can hold the Alt key. On Macintosh, you can hold the Option key and then press press the Delete key on the keyboard, and that will fill with whichever color it may be. In this case, black is my foreground color, so Alt Delete on Windows or Option Delete on Macintosh. The background color you can fill with by using Control Delete on Windows or Command Delete on Macintosh. But for my money, if I just want to get the opposite, it's just a simple inversion. Control-I on Windows, Command-I on Macintosh after making sure that the layer mask itself is active. If you're not sure if the layer mask is active, simply click on the thumbnail for the layer mask to make sure, and then you can just use that keyboard shortcut. And with that layer mask active, you might even notice down on the Properties panel, if we're looking at masks, that we have an Invert button as well. That's only like 5 of the 47 different ways that you could possibly invert a mask. But mostly, depending on what you're doing and how you're working, sometimes you might want to fill with middle gray, for example. There's all sorts of variations. So depending on your needs, you might want to choose a particular approach, and based on your preference. I like keyboard shortcuts personally. Well, not all of them. I like certain ones, and I spend a lot of time with the ones that I like. All right, so now black blocks, white reveals. This very strong curves adjustment is having absolutely no effect on the image whatsoever because the layer mask is filled with black, and black blocks. And in the context of an adjustment layer, what are we blocking? The adjustment. So I don't see the adjustment anywhere, but that is very easy to fix. I'm going to choose my brush tool. I'll press the letter D on the keyboard to set my default colors of black and white if they weren't already set that way. Once again, we can use the letter X on the keyboard. Remember that when we were dodging and burning? To swap or exchange those foreground and background colors. In this case, I want to paint with white because now I've essentially, you might say, erased the effect from the image, and I'm going to paint it in exactly where I want to. Again, this is mostly a psychological thing. I could have just painted black where I don't want it, but I like to start with a black mask and paint in the adjustment where I do want it. So I'll go ahead and just paint it in. See how easy that is? In this case, obviously, I used a very simple example of an image that basically is just cut in half between sky and the foreground. In other cases, you might have a little bit more complicated painting to do, depending on the shape of the area that you're trying to affect. Here, it was pretty simple because I chose an image that would make it very easy on myself. But you'll remember, I think, that the tip also said gradients. Well, let's take a look at what that layer mask actually looks like. White on top, black on the bottom, adjustment, no adjustment. I'm affecting the top roughly half of the photo, and I'm not affecting the bottom half of the photo, give or take, and I have a pretty smooth transition in between. Doesn't that remind you of a graduated split neutral density filter? Available at B&H. Yes, well, I actually could use the gradient tool to, in this case, streamline the approach of creating that shape, that stencil that I need to define, or that I needed to define. I'll go ahead and choose the gradient tool, letter G on the keyboard. So gradient tool from the toolbox, and then I'm going to go up to the options bar and take a look at the settings for my gradient tool. That first pop-up, I'm going to click that pop-up, that gradient pop-up. Look at all the rainbow gradients, all sorts of crazy colors we can add, but I just want the first one. Now the first one looks like it's black to white. It's actually not. I mean, it is, but it's not, if you know what I mean. And what I mean by that is that that first preset for the gradient tool is actually the foreground color to background color option. It happens to be black and white right now, or white to black, because that's how my colors are configured, but it could just as easily have been black to white, or middle gray to black, or whatever the case might be. So bear that in mind. That first option is actually the foreground color to background color. So as I press the letter X to swap or exchange my foreground and background colors, if you take a look on the options bar, you'll see that changes as well. Or if I set it to red to white or blue to green, or whatever it might be, that would be reflected in that pop-up. In this case, I'm going to use white to black. Then I have a set of 5 style buttons, and I just want that first one very simple, linear, a straight line transition. You can do all sorts of wild and wonderful things with the gradient tool. In this case, I'm looking for something pretty straightforward, so I'll just use that linear option. Blend mode normal, opacity 100%, dithering and transparency, not really critical in this particular example, but those defaults are perfectly fine. So then, I'm going to go ahead and reveal the layer mask itself so we can talk briefly about how that gradient tool works. It's so easy. All you do is click and drag. So I'm going to click from the far left side of the image and drag over toward the right side of the image. And now I get a transition from white to black, going from left to right in the image. So I drag from the far left over to the far right, and I get a transition from white on the left to black on the right. Or I could drag from top to bottom. Or I could drag from bottom to top. I could drag a really short little line. I can drag a diagonal line. I can drag a short diagonal line. A medium. You get the idea. Here's my favorite. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll want to rewind and replay that one for sure. So what do I want in this case? Well, it helps to be looking at the picture so I know where I want to drag, but that gives you the basic idea. I want a gradient that looks roughly like that, wouldn't you say? White on the top, black on the bottom. The image is being adjusted at the top, is not being adjusted on the bottom, and perhaps most importantly, nice, smooth transition in between. Well, let's take a look at the actual image. And we'll go ahead and just replace that gradient just a few times, as we saw earlier, diagonal, whatever the case may be. Sometimes maybe you had an image where the sun was kind of glaring over on the left side, so you need to darken the left side, but then have that gradually transition. Or sometimes the water in the foreground is really super saturated. You need to tone it down a little, but not the rest of the picture. So there's a whole bunch of situations where this works well. The sky is naturally the most obvious example, but there's all sorts of situations where I might use it. So I'm transitioning between, in this case, white to black, completely adjusted, completely not adjusted, with the transition in between, and I'm just dragging across to define the transition. So here, maybe it would be something along those lines, for example. Again, bearing in mind that this is a very much exaggerated adjustment, but you can see that now we're affecting the sky, and then we start to taper off as we get down into the foreground. If I then go back to my actual adjustment and make that, a little less wild, then you start to see that, we can have a useful effect. I might need, if it's a strong adjustment, to have a stronger impact or a longer transition in the photo. So you see as I drag a longer distance, that I smooth out the transition, and suddenly, even with a strong adjustment, it works out pretty well. The idea is that I'm kind of going back and forth. But how simple is this? Let me go fine-tune my adjustment. Let me come back and redraw my gradient. Maybe I need to fix the angle. Speaking of which, if you're having a hard time making that vertical line perfectly vertical, just hold the Shift key, and that will lock you to those 45-degree increments. You see how the gradient line there is snapping to those 45-degree increments? How easy is that? And again, I would tend to sort of balance back and forth, draw the gradient, go back to my adjustment, fine-tune things, come back, maybe redraw the gradient, whatever's necessary to produce the most amazing picture ever. Give or take. Critically evaluate your masks. Step number 6, or tip number 6, I should say. This one is probably the most important tip to take to heart when it comes to applying targeted adjustments or just using layer masks in Photoshop in general. Let's take a look at perhaps absurdly exaggerated example. I'll make a couple of examples here. We're going to start off with, of course, what do we always want to do to a picture? We want to adjust the sky. And so I'll add a curves adjustment layer because why not? And I'll make a dramatic adjustment to the image, maybe something there. That's looking much better. That's exactly the way I remember the sky looking. And then I'll invert that layer mask, choose my brush tool, make sure my foreground color is set to white, and then I can paint the effect into the image. Obviously, I'm using a little bit oversized brush, too much softening of the edge, too soft a brush, so that's blending a little bit, but you get the idea. You know what else this image really needs? Saturation, of course. And so I'm going to add a hue saturation adjustment layer, and temporarily we'll make it an exaggerated effect, just a little exaggerated. I mean, this is almost what it looked like, but not quite. And then we'll invert that mask once again, bearing in mind that inverting of the mask, totally optional. I just personally tend to like applying the adjustment in a targeted way, painting the adjustment into the image, as opposed to erasing the effect. Either way is perfectly fine. This is just my quirk. All right, so once again, painting with white, I'll reduce that brush size a little bit. And painting with white, I usually start off, if I'm defining a particular area where I'm painting, I start off defining the edge, the transition between the area I want to affect versus not affect. That's like a bonus tip, no extra charge for that one. And so in this case, that would mean, for example, painting along the edge of the water because I just want to increase the saturation in the water. And so I'll paint very carefully right across that edge. And then, maybe reduce the brush size so I can be a little bit more precise. And then I'll come down here, and paint that. And there we go. Almost completely perfect. Right about like that. And maybe we need an adjustment for something else. Let's make it also a curves adjustment. We need a totally unique adjustment for just the mountains. Maybe somewhere around there. There, much more dramatic. And once again, we'll just paint the adjustment in for only the mountains. There we go. See how easy this stuff is? And look at what great results you can achieve in no time at all. Hopefully I don't need to explain why that one's funny. All right, so how have we done? I mentioned that this session is being recorded and will be on YouTube soon, right? So this is where you cheer and say, "That's amazing, Tim. How did you do it? Please tell us." But first, let's make sure we really did as good a job as it looks like on the surface.
Do tell.
Do tell, yeah. So there's a few things that I recommend doing when it comes to evaluating your masks. And the first is a real simple technique of turning off the adjustment and turning it back on again. It's like before, after, before, after. And you start to say, wait a minute, why is that one little ridge of the mountain staying hazy when everything else changes? But by turning the adjustment off and on, those areas kind of stand out a little bit better. It's like, whoa, okay, most of the mountain is changing, but big, huge areas were missed. All right, so just turning off. So again, clicking on the eye icon, that eyeball icon, to the left of the applicable adjustment layer in this case, we'll turn off the effect, we'll turn off the adjustment altogether, and clicking on that empty space will bring the eye icon back and brings back the adjustment. So we can just toggle it off and on. If we have multiple adjustments, which I do in this case, we have a bonus tip, once again, at no additional charge. So that same little technique of clicking on the eye icon will cause the layer for which you clicked, the eye icon, to disappear versus reappear. If you hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh, that behavior changes a little bit so that you're revealing only one layer, hiding everything else, or bringing back all of the layers. So for example, I can get a global before and after look at the image by holding the Alt or Option key and clicking the eye icon for my background image layer so that all adjustments disappear, and still holding the Alt or Option key, click again, and by going back and forth, again holding the Alt or Option key and clicking multiple times, I kind of go back and forth between the before and after version. And again, some pretty obvious problems start to appear. It becomes readily apparent by looking at that overall before and the overall after. Also, remarkably helpful, but you have to keep this in context. The couple of things I've just shown you are very important in terms of getting a feel for the overall image and whether or not the adjustment is affecting the specific areas you want it to. But also important is to actually look at the actual mask. And so to do that, you've already seen it a few times. We can hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh while clicking on the thumbnail for a layer mask. So I'll go ahead and Alt or Option click on the layer mask that I used to define an adjustment that I only wanted to affect the water in the foreground. And wow, what a horrible job I did. You can see that I missed the bottom right corner. You can see that I missed a little swipe across the bottom left side. I kind of missed a whole middle section. I dipped off on the right side. Actually, it's easier to say what I did wrong, no, what I did right than what I did wrong. It's horrible. I mean, it kind of roughly matches what I had in mind, adjusting, we'll call it more or less the bottom half or the bottom third of the image, not adjusting the top of the image. But what a mess. Well, remember how I mentioned that I start off defining that transition or that edge, the edge of the object. In this case, my object, the thing I'm trying to apply an adjustment to for this specific adjustment layer, is the water. And so we have roughly, not exactly, but kind of a straight line going across the edge of the water. So that's what I want to get right first. So I'll go ahead and paint along that top edge and try to make sure that it's absolutely perfect. Again, because I have an exaggerated adjustment applied, it's reasonably easy to see the effect in the photo. But then I'll take a look at that layer mask. Now the top line looks pretty good. Well, how would we know? We don't see it in the context of the photo right now. And so it's important to keep in mind that we're looking at black and white pixels and shades of gray. We're not seeing the photo. We don't know that that top line really aligns with the top of the water. So this isn't our only method for evaluating the mask, but it certainly is helpful. But I know that everything below that line, I want to be white. I want to be affected by my adjustment. I want to be part of the white area of my stencil. Well, I don't have to go back to the photo. I can fix it right here. While I'm actually looking at the layer mask itself, I can paint with white and clean up the mess I've made. Did I get it all? Oh my goodness, I missed so much. It would be embarrassing, except I know that you know that I did it bad on purpose so that I could teach you something.
Of course.
I hope. Maybe in the final video of this on YouTube, they can put like, it's really true. He did it on purpose. So now I'll Alt or Option click once again on the thumbnail for that layer mask. In this case, once again, looking at the hue saturation adjustment that is ostensibly only affecting the water. And now if I turn that adjustment off or on, obviously, or at least it may be obvious to you, because I was using a soft brush that was too big and I painted really close to the edge of the water, the adjustment does blend up into the top of the image, or up outside of the water a little bit. We won't worry about that. We'll just pretend like it was perfect. The adjustment obviously is a little bit too exaggerated, maybe just a tiny little, like 3% too saturated. So we'll turn that down just a little bit. Maybe somewhere around there, for example. I don't know, that might be a little too much still, but at least so we can see it there. So now just boosting the color in the water, for example, without affecting the rest of the image. And more importantly, really critically evaluating that layer mask to make sure that when we define the stencil that says this is where I want to have this effect, that we're being as accurate as possible. We'll talk more about that accuracy momentarily, but again, the key is to make sure that you are being as accurate as possible when it comes to defining those layer masks. And it's one area I mentioned earlier that I love, or not love to be, but I am lazy. And so I try to, skip out of any work that I possibly can. When it comes to layer masks, I'm not cutting any corners. I mean, unless I, do it on purpose to show you the mistakes that you can run into. But I try to be really, really careful about the layer masks, really pay attention to detail and evaluate those layer masks, because even when it looks like you did a great job, you might have missed a particular area in the photo. We'll go back to this one, for example. It looks perfect. Did I get everything? It looks like in this case I finally got that layer mask cleaned up. I don't see any obvious problems, but again, I need to evaluate the image itself in addition to the mask. But by coming into this layer mask view, actually looking at the layer mask itself, once again by holding the Alt or Option key and clicking on the thumbnail for the layer mask, any areas that you just barely missed, you got a little white sliver in the black area or a little black sliver in the white area, little shades of gray here and there, those are going to stand out pretty well, and it makes it much easier to clean up those sorts of problems. All right. Before, after. You see, once you start mitigating those adjustments, suddenly it doesn't look quite so bad, right? All right. Number 7. Tip number 7 for applying targeted adjustments in Photoshop is to learn to make selections. I am not suggesting this is the most important skill you could possibly have when it comes to applying targeted adjustments in Photoshop, but it's a very helpful one. It depends on the specifics. We'll talk more about some of the nuance related to that momentarily. But for now, let's take a look at how we might use a selection as the basis of a targeted adjustment. In many respects, it's the easiest. It's absolutely the easiest way to work, because Photoshop is kind of doing a lot of the work for you, or could be doing a lot of the work for you, depending on the approach you take. And there are really only a few tools that you need for creating selections in Photoshop. There's some special commands. There's all sorts of stuff we could cover. I could do a whole session on just creating selections in Photoshop, but that's not today. So let's take a look at some of the basics in terms of how you might work with selections, and we'll look at an example of a couple different techniques that we might use. So I'm going to start off by creating a quick and easy selection. They should have called it the quick and easy selection tool. They just called it the quick selection tool. I guess they didn't want to use too many words. So I'm going to choose the quick selection tool, which is indeed the quick and easy selection tool. I will turn on the sample all layers checkbox so that I'm creating a selection based on how the image actually looks And so I don't have to worry about whether or not I chose the right layer. It could still be a layer mask or whatever the case may be. I don't have to think about it. So I just leave that checkbox turned on almost without exception. Auto Enhance, I leave turned on almost without exception. There are a few situations where it might cause a little bit of a problem. You might not see it today. You might not see it next week. You might not see it for a long time. But every now and then, if you have Auto Enhance turned on and you're using the quick selection tool and you paint in an area that you want to select, after you release the mouse, you might see your selection line kind of bounce around a little bit and then settle down. That's Auto Enhance at work. If it bounces around and it looks worse than what it was before the bouncing started, you might want to turn off that option. But again, in almost all cases, I leave Auto Enhance turned on. In this case, what do I want to adjust? The sky or the rock that looks curiously like an owl?
The owl.
The owl. Why? Because the sky would be too easy. That was the easy answer. However, despite the magic of the quick selection tool, one of the things I think is really important to keep in mind when it comes to selections is that very often it's easier to select what you don't need than to select what you do need. It's easier to select the sky, I can assure you, than it is to select the foreground. So very often, I start with the exact opposite of what I wanted. And let's see how easy it can be done. It looked like a couple of you were blinking, so I'm going to do that again in case you missed it. I'm going to deselect. You ready? Quick selection tool. It should really be called. I think maybe we start a letter writing campaign. Everybody write a letter to Adobe and tell them that we want them to rename the quick selection tool to the quick and easy selection tool, maybe parenthetically inspired by Tim or something like that, just because it's worth an effort. Are you ready? Watch this. Click, drag. Whoa. That was amazing. The quick and easy and amazing selection tool. How's it going to do on the foreground? Not as impressive. I mean, if I drag around a little bit, it'll do pretty darn good. There we go. But that was like, 12% more clicking and dragging than I really needed to do. Pretty good. It helps when you have a well-defined subject versus, background. I mean, that's why I picked this image. But yes, you can see, little swipe across the sky, and we have what is very clearly an absolutely perfect selection, as long as we don't zoom in. Which is another bonus tip I'll throw out there. If you want to feel a lot better about your pictures, zoom out. Don't zoom in. I mean, look, how much more accurate does that selection look now? I defy you to find a single pixel that's out of place. And you couldn't even tell me whether that picture was sharp or not. We start zooming in like this, and it looks a little soft. And let's see, I'll bet you we're going to find a pixel out of place. Well, all right, maybe not. Wait, there's one right there. So again, zooming in, I mean, I guess it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you want better images, probably better to zoom in. If you want to feel good about your pictures, definitely zoom out. So I zoom out a lot. Oh wait, no, look, we found that, look at that. That is an egregious error on the part of the quick selection tool. I don't know why I am acting proud that I found that the quick selection tool made a mistake, but it did. Now I could keep fighting the quick selection tool to try to get a better selection, but I don't. I'm a peaceable or peaceful or something, one of those peace words kind of guy. More, I don't want to be bothered with fighting a tool. And it's not usually worth the effort. I could look at the tiny little space there. I mean, probably nobody would ever notice if I print the picture really small. It's like zooming out, when you're printing. I could make my brush size really, really small, and I could paint right down the center of that. Yes, and it would work actually really, really well, probably perfectly. But rarely will I use the same tool to create an initial selection and then to fine-tune the selection. It tends to be a little more work than it's worth. And so instead, for little cleanup work like this, I tend to use the lasso tool. the lasso tool, found right above the quick selection tool on the toolbox. It is possibly the most flexible and, in some respects, powerful selection tool in all of Photoshop. However, it is also the most labor-intensive selection tool in all of Photoshop. I mentioned that I'm lazy, right? So I never make a selection from scratch using the lasso tool because it requires me to trace along the exact edge of the selection that I want to make. No, thank you. But I use it all the time for cleaning up my selections. So another little tip when you're working with selection tools in Photoshop is how to add to or subtract from an existing selection. By default, most of the selection tools, if you just start clicking and dragging or whatever the particular behavior is with that selection tool, it will replace the existing selection with the new selection that you're creating. The quick selection tool is different in that regard, but all of the normal selection tools or the other selection tools have this behavior that by default, they're going to create a new selection. And so if I just start clicking and dragging, I'm going to replace my existing selection with this new selection. Instead, in this particular case, I want to either add to the existing selection or subtract from the existing selection. I would have to stop and think about it for a second whether I want to add or subtract. But if I wanted to add, that would be the Shift key on the keyboard. We have buttons for it up on the options bar. There's a set of 4 buttons, but why burn all those extra calories going up to the options bar, clicking a button, coming back down into the image? I just leave the option set to create a new selection and then use these keyboard shortcuts. So Shift for add, and then Alt on Windows or Option on Macintosh when you want to subtract. Or if you want to intersect, both of those keys at the same time. So Shift plus Alt on Windows, Shift plus Option on Macintosh, and you get intersect. What is intersect? Some sort of mathematical thing. I'll show you intersect in a minute. All right, so in this case, do I want to add or subtract? I know it's obvious to all of you, but I've been busy trying to not lose my place and make funny jokes and all this other stuff. So for me right now, plus you guys are all staring at me, it's very intimidating. I cannot remember what it is that I'm making a selection of. I know it sounds silly, but it might happen to you sometime too. So slow down and stop and think, what am I actually making the selection of? Well, it's even easier to get confused because I'm selecting the opposite of what I really want. I want to select the owl rock, but I decided it was easier to select the sky. But now that I've calmed down a little bit, I remember that the selection I'm currently making is for the sky, and since there's a piece of sky missing, I want to add to selection. I know it was a lot easier for you guys, but I'm under a lot of pressure up here. So I'm going to hold the Shift key and then click and drag along the edge of that area that was missed. This is much easier with a Wacom tablet, by the way, as opposed to a mouse. If you have not tried out a tablet, I certainly recommend it. I'd be doing a way better job if I was using a tablet instead of a mouse. Can I blame that for why my selection is less than absolutely perfect? All right. So just using that lasso tool, quick and easy. And I'll actually work in this way. Another little handy-dandy keyboard shortcut, the space bar on the keyboard will give you the hand tool regardless of what tool you're currently using. So we can hold the space bar to get the hand tool and then click and drag throughout the image to see all the wonderful JPEG artifacting on the edge of the rock, just because it's a low-res JPEG. Oh, here's a little area that I missed. So once again, holding the Shift key to add to selection and just draw a little loop around that area. So really easy. Would I really go to this level of detail when it's being filmed? You bet I would. I really would, if I had a very clear delineation between the area I'm trying to adjust versus the rest of the photo. If it's sort of a nebulous thing, like with the gradient, we can kind of not worry too much because we're going to use a nice big transition. If I am working on rock versus sky where there's a pretty clear transition, I'm going to be very, very careful when it comes to defining that selection. All right, so is that perfect? Looks that way, except it's still a selection of the sky, right? I want it to be a selection of the rock, of everything except the sky, essentially. So while it was easier to make the selection of the sky, that's the opposite of what I really wanted. And so I essentially just want to invert, not the invert we saw earlier, that's for pixels you might say, but to invert the selection. So we can go to the select menu and choose inverse. For fans of keyboard shortcuts like myself, that is Control-Shift-I on Windows and Command-Shift-I on Macintosh. Or just select inverse from the menu. I'll go ahead and choose it from the menu since I'm already there. And now you see that we have a selection for, in this case, the rock in the foreground, owl rock in the foreground as opposed to the sky. What if, hypothetically speaking, I actually only wanted to select the owl, not the pedestal upon which this owl is sitting? Hypothetically speaking. The only reason I bring up that example is so that I can show you intersect. Because the intersect, it's one of those that seems really complicated or really weird or hard to understand on the surface. It's actually super simple. Intersect means deselect everything except this. So add to selection, that's easy. See this area right here? Please add it to that other existing selection or the rest of the selection. See this area right here? I want to subtract it from the selection. Intersect creates a selection that represents the overlap of the existing selection with the selection that you are now currently drawing. You know, intersect. I think it's a lot easier to think of it as deselect everything but this, or only keep this thing selected. So I'll use the lasso tool just because, and I will hold the Shift and Option keys on Macintosh or the Shift and Alt keys on Windows. Up here, do I need to be precise? No, because my selection edge is already very clearly defined as the owl rock. So I'm just going to start up here, and hey, I am drawing a big loop. Okay, now I got to start being careful, so hold on. I am drawing a loop. I don't know where the owl ends and the rock begins, actually, so we're totally just making this up. But I am drawing a selection around the area of the selection that I want to keep selected. There we go. So you can see that the owl, the existing selection that includes the owl, plus the current selection that I'm still in the middle of drawing, overlap each other. In other words, I'm saying to Photoshop, deselect everything but this. Or keep everything that is selected inside this area selected, get rid of everything else. And Shazam. We have a selection of just the owl. So the intersect one, you start playing with it and you're thinking probably, possibly, I'm never, ever going to need this. But then when you see it like this, I think you'll find lots of situations where, oh, I selected all the blue stuff in the picture, except that includes the sky plus the reflections on the lake. I only want the sky, lasso, intersect, and a big lazy loop around the sky. Just be sure not to touch the water. Boom, it's done. Really, really simple. So once you kind of understand the concepts involved, that one gets to be very, very helpful. Okay, that part was easy. Now we get to the hard part. Now we need to take this selection and convert it into a layer mask for an adjustment layer that applies an adjustment that only affects the owl. Now that would sound scary and dramatic if I hadn't started off with tip 1 that said don't believe the hype. This stuff's really not as complicated as it might seem if you try to make it look difficult. Because what's a selection?
It is a stencil.
It's a stencil representing whatever you selected. So in this case, it's a stencil that identifies owl rock versus the rest of the picture. Everybody sees the owl, right? Who does not see the owl in the rock?
I'm looking at the.
Who? Who does?
I'm looking at the marching ants.
Who does? So now I have this selection for this owl rock. What does it look like? Well, to us, it looks like kind of marching ants. It looks like this animated dashed line. What's Photoshop thinking about right now?
This is the area that I want to take.
The stencil. And in Photoshop's little gigantic, very intelligent mind, what does that look like, that stencil? Black and white, where the owl rock is white and the rest of the image is black. Therefore, we need to create, based on this selection, based on this stencil that's black and white in the center, we'll call it black on the outside.
Mask.
We need a layer mask for an adjustment layer. What's that layer mask going to look like? The exact same thing. And it's actually going to be represented by an alpha channel on the channels palette that is the exact same thing. It's all the same stuff. It just sounds more complicated because, well, people like making things sound complicated. So how are we actually going to accomplish it? It's so easy. Remember the adjustment layer that we added? And I said, even if you don't think you're using targeted adjustments, even if you don't think you're using layer masks, you already are if you're using adjustment layers, because adjustment layers come with masks automatically. Adjustment layers come with layer masks automatically. Oh. What about when you have a selection active? Well, take a look at this. We're going to add a curves adjustment layer. So we're not really doing anything we haven't already done, except that we're doing things in a different order. I have a selection active on my image, and I'm adding an adjustment layer. An adjustment layer comes with a layer mask automatically. By default, that adjustment layer mask is filled with white, all white. But if I have a selection active, that adjustment layer mask is a stencil based on the selection that was active at the time. Black blocks, white reveals. So right now, this adjustment is blocked for the majority of the image. But it is revealed for the little owl perched on, this rocky ledge. And what effect are we having on the owl? Absolutely none, because we haven't yet made any changes to the adjustment. Obviously, the adjustment by itself doesn't do anything yet, but as soon as I apply an adjustment, you'll see that that adjustment is only affecting the area of the image that I had previously selected. So just make a selection, add an adjustment, and the adjustment automatically only affects the selected area. It's so easy, but it comes back to knowing how to make selections in the first place. There are, of course, a variety of other selection tools available within Photoshop, and I certainly encourage a mastery of all of them. I'll just make an exaggerated. Let's give the owl here lots and lots of contrast just so it stands out a little bit, and we can see that we've applied an adjustment just for that one area. So incredibly simple. Once you learn to make use of those selection tools in Photoshop, a few of which we've taken a look at here, well, okay, two of which we've taken a look at here, you can then use those selections to very easily apply adjustments that affect specific areas of the photo. We'll take a look at that in more detail. There's a step that's missing. It doesn't look like there's a step missing because this has turned out so remarkably well, but there is a step missing that we will return to. But first, tip number 8. Remember shades of gray. This has no relation to any books, nor to myself. You can see they spelled gray wrong. Well, I guess I spelled gray wrong because I spelled it like the color instead of like me. But I digress. And let's take a look at shades of gray. All right. And in this example, we will decide that we want to open up some shadow detail. What might we use for opening up shadow detail? Well, we certainly could use dodging and burning, but in this case, I'm not thinking about lightening or darkening. I just want to open up detail. So I'm just going to add a curves adjustment. And as is almost always the case, if not literally always the case, I'm going to start off with an exaggerated adjustment. And in this case, we'll make it super duper exaggerated, so it'll be easier to see. And again, when I'm applying targeted adjustments, remember there are two basic steps involved with targeted adjustments. One, targeted. Two, adjustment. The targeted is a stencil, defining that stencil or the layer mask, and the other is refining the adjustment. I can go back and forth as much as I want. There's a totally non-destructive workflow. So at first, I'm not worried about a perfect adjustment. I'm worried about getting that adjustment exactly where I want it, and it makes it a heck of a lot easier for me to see what I'm doing if that adjustment is exaggerated in the photo. So I'll apply an exaggerated adjustment that is along the lines of what I'm actually after, but that is overly exaggerated so that it's more obvious what I'm doing. Once again, I think this also helps to illustrate why I generally prefer to have the adjustment be painted into the image instead of painting where I want to block it. In many cases, the area that I want to adjust is a relatively small portion of the image, and just from my own standpoint, my own mental perspective on the image, I'm thinking more about where I want the adjustment, not so much where I don't want the adjustment. So I'll just press Control-I on Windows or Command-I on Macintosh to invert my layer mask so that the mask is now filled with black. And so the image is having absolutely no effect whatsoever from that adjustment, that exaggerated curves adjustment that is aimed at brightening shadow detail. Again, keep in mind, the adjustment is exaggerated right now so that I can better see what I'm doing, because as soon as I start painting, things are going to look pretty crazy. So I'll grab my brush tool. I'll make sure that I'm working with a soft-edged brush. We've already set that, but just for repeat, we can see up at the left side of the options bar, if we click that pop-up for the brush, we have a hardness value. We'll set that to 0. You can also just choose one of the fuzzy brushes down here. You can see which ones have a soft edge versus a hard edge. I usually, for this type of stuff, use very simple round brushes, although I might use, a little oval brush or maybe a funny shaped brush in certain situations. But by and large, just a round, simple, soft-edged brush. And then I'll come into the image. Again, I'm painting directly on the layer mask. The mask is currently black. The adjustment affects none of the photo. And then I say, okay, well, I really want to open up some shadow detail down through here. And so I'm going to just paint with white in those areas. And I have a very strong, too strong an effect, but a very strong effect. I'm going to come back to that adjustment in just a moment. But for now, I'm just applying the, painting into the image to define which areas I want to have that adjustment apply to. Well, that's all well and good. I'll go ahead and reveal the mask here. I've just painted a streak. The white area is my stencil identifying exactly where in the photo I want the adjustment to apply. White reveals. And the black areas are those where I do not want the adjustment. Black blocks. Well, those are the extremes, right? Black blocks, white reveals. What about everything in between? Well, actually, we've already seen that. It's called the gradient, right? Because what is that gradient really accomplishing? It's transitioning from black to white or white to black, as the case may be, with shades of gray. It's going from black to a little bit lighter shade of black, to a little bit lighter gray, to a middle gray, to a really, really light gray until it gets to white. It's just a gradual transition in tonal values. We have the exact same thing right here. I'm using a soft-edged brush, so I'm painting white onto black, but with a soft edge, so I get a fuzzy transition. Shades of gray. But I can take it a step further, come back to the image itself, and let's just assume that this area over here, I also want to open up the shadow detail, but not as much. Well, I can click on my foreground color, which is currently set to white, and I can take a look at the brightness value. The B value. What is the brightness of white? 100%. What is the brightness of black? 0%. Black blocks, white reveals. Consider the correlation there. White has a 100% brightness value. Black has a 0% brightness value. On a layer mask, white causes the adjustment to affect the image 100% in that area. Black causes the adjustment to be visible 0% in that area. How strong an effect do you want in that other area? 74, 76, 62, was that? 62%. So I'll change that to 62%, because why not? Usually I would just go 50%. 75%, 25%. But 60, what do we say, 62? That's a good number also. So I will now paint into this area of the photo, for example. Well, let's click on our foreground color once again and set that brightness value to, let's call it 20. I only want a 20% effect, hardly any effect at all, just a little bit. And I'm just going to paint up in here, just for the sake of having somewhere to paint. See this area that's getting lightened up just a little bit. Bear in mind, it's an exaggerated adjustment, so when I tone things down, it's going to become really, really subtle. But the point is that I can paint with shades of gray to have a variable impact on the image. So I can use a single adjustment and have a strong or a full effect in this area, a roughly half effect in this area, a 20% effect in that area. Obviously, the specific numbers that you're using there, 20 versus 22%, you'll never see the difference between the two. The point being is that you can have that variable effect by adjusting the color that you're painting with. Black blocks the adjustment, white reveals the adjustment, shades of gray reveal the adjustment to the degree that shade of gray is nearly white. So 50% gray shows the effect 50%. 80% gray shows the effect 80%. All right? So pretty straightforward. Of course, though, in this case, we've applied a very, very strong effect. I'm going to go back to my adjustment, in this case, a curves adjustment, and tone things down a little bit, maybe something like that. And so you can see, as I toggle the visibility of that adjustment, in this area over here, we're having a rather strong effect, opening up a lot of shadow detail. Over in this area, I didn't need as much opening up of the shadow detail, so it's, what was that, 62% I think that was. And up here, let's toggle that adjustment, and if you look closely, you'll see it's almost like a tiny little fill flash effect on this little area of the rock wall there. There it's a little darker, there it's a little brighter, a very subtle effect. But the point being, again, by making use of those shades of gray on the layer mask, we're able to have a variable effect in various areas of the image while still using a single, potentially, adjustment layer for the entire effect. So I'm using, for example, curves to open up shadow detail, but I'm having a different effect in some areas versus other areas, a stronger effect in some areas versus other areas. All right? Tip number 9 for targeted adjustments in Photoshop: leverage layer groups. Layer groups I absolutely love. And I'm going to show you 2 basic methods, you might say, of how we're going to leverage layer groups. So let's open up a different image here. All right. So here's one of the things. So far, everything that we've talked about is assuming, on some level at least, that we're applying a single adjustment in a single area of the photo. We can do better. And in fact, in almost all cases, when I'm applying a targeted adjustment to an image in Photoshop, I will apply more than one adjustment to that specific area. So let's take a look at the sky. We want to adjust the sky. What effect do we want to have on the sky? Well, we might want to darken the sky, we might want to increase contrast in the sky, we might want to increase saturation in the sky, we might want to fix the color balance in the sky. There are all kinds of things that we might want to do. Now, we could make a layer mask once, and then copy that layer mask to another adjustment, and then copy that layer mask to another adjustment, and then copy that layer mask to another adjustment. And now we have 4 adjustments with 4 layer masks. And if we later discover, hypothetically speaking, this never happened to me so far, but you want to be prepared for these potential pitfalls. What if I decide the layer mask was not perfect? Now I have to go fix it 4 times. I'm lazy. I don't want to have to go back and fix it 4 times. I barely want to have to go back and fix it once, but I want to use one layer mask to control an entire set of adjustments. One mask to define one area of the image, and then I'll apply as many adjustments to that area as I want. It's made possible by layer groups. Let's start off as we normally would. We will, I'm going to choose the magic wand tool. I'm going to turn off the contiguous option because I have some discontiguous areas of the sky that I need to select. And I'm just going to click in the sky and then shift click in a few additional areas of the sky until I have what appears to be an absolutely perfect selection of the sky. I'm going to lasso that little, probably a dust spot down there. I mean, probably not a dust spot because I don't get those, but probably some other issue. that, and actually I've got some areas now in the statue because of all that clicking I was doing. So we're going to have to fix that with our quick selection tool, and we're going to subtract the statue, etc. And eventually, this should only take about another 20 minutes or so. Eventually, we end up with a selection that's perfect. Now, in this case, do we have a selection that's actually perfect? I highly doubt it, nor are we going to spend the extra time trying to make sure that it's absolutely perfect. We are going to assume that it is absolutely, completely perfect. Except for that right there, which we didn't notice until 2 minutes from now. All right. So we have a selection that we think is perfect, actually that we know is perfect, except for the part that's actually we're going to allow is not perfect, but not for another like 2 or 3 minutes when we discover it. Does that all make sense? Me either, yeah. All right, so we have a selection of the sky. What would we normally be doing right now? We would be adding an adjustment layer so that this selection could automatically be used as the basis of that layer mask for the adjustment layer. In other words, the adjustment will only affect the sky in this case. But at this moment I say, wait, I remember I was at the B&H Photo event space, and Tim Gray, timgray.com, you can find me on Facebook and all those things, he gave an amazing presentation that was humorous and educational, informative, and entertaining all at the same time, and he said something about layer groups. So pause, I'm not going to add an adjustment layer. Instead, I'm going to add an adjustment layer group, you might say. Not literally an adjustment layer group, because no such thing exists, but a layer group that we're going to be using specifically for our adjustments. Let's put it all together so it makes sense, we hope. All right, so instead of adding an adjustment layer, I'm going to add a layer group. See that little folder icon down at the bottom of the layers panel? I'm going to click that folder icon, that add layer group button, and I'm going to add a group that I can use to make all this magic that I've been talking about actually happen. Taking things a step further, remember normally when I'm working with a targeted adjustment, or at least so far until we got to the wonderful and amazing tip number 9, we've been working with a single adjustment layer with a single layer mask. Now we're going to take things a step further. When we add an adjustment layer, there's a layer mask that automatically is included with that adjustment layer. Layer groups don't automatically have that, so we have to add it ourselves. No problem. So I'll make sure that my layer group, my brand new layer group, is active or selected, you might say, on the layers panel, and then I'll click on the Add Layer Mask button. Oh, things are starting to come together. So now we have a layer mask attached to a layer group, and the layer mask defines the sky. It is a stencil for the sky, you might say. In fact, I'm going to double click on the name of the layer group, and I'm going to type Sky Adjustments, just so I never forget what that group is there for. All right? Now let's apply an adjustment. I'll go ahead and let's assume that we want some contrast. I'll add a curves adjustment, and I'll go ahead and make this a little bit exaggerated just so that it becomes a little more obvious. And we'll add a hue saturation adjustment just because we want an exaggerated effect. And maybe I'll add a color balance adjustment. At the moment, it really is not important which specific adjustments I'm adding. We're really just trying to make an obvious change in the image that only affects the sky. Because I had a layer group active when I added my adjustment layers, and therefore the adjustment layer went inside the layer group. And that layer group has a layer mask defining the sky. I don't need to touch the layer masks for my individual adjustment layers. All of the adjustment layers that I've just added are inside my Sky Adjustments layer group. Because that Sky Adjustments layer group has a layer mask defining the sky, all of those adjustments only affect the sky. This is so amazing. You might not realize just how amazing this is yet. It might take a while till after you get home or something. But what else might we add? Let's make a levels adjustment also, because we really want to brighten up the whites in the sky, and we're going to tone that down just a little bit. I now have 4 adjustments. Each of those adjustments has a layer mask that's filled with white. The adjustment theoretically is affecting the entire image, except that each of those adjustments is inside a layer group, and that layer group has a layer mask defining the sky. So now, when I realized that there was a mistake with my original selection, how many times do I have to fix it? Only once. So I can go back to my mask. In fact, let's just take a look at that mask, and you can see the little mess I made based on that original selection. I can fix one mask in one place. I'll just go ahead and grab the brush tool and make sure that my foreground color is set to white. And obviously, this will not be a perfect effect because I only have like 12 seconds to actually finish all of this. But you get the idea here. I can clean up this area of that layer mask, a single mask that is constraining the impact of, in this case, how many did we get up to? 4 adjustment layers. So 4 adjustment layers, all of which are only affecting the sky because of one layer mask. So if there's anything about that layer mask that is not quite perfect, I only have to go fix it in one place. And obviously, this is reasonably close to perfect cleanup work. I mentioned it's very intimidating to work while people are watching you, right? Hey, everybody turn away for a second. No, just kidding. All right, so just one layer mask to clean up because I put all of my adjustments for the sky inside of a layer group, and I used a layer mask in conjunction with that layer group to constrain the visibility of all of those adjustments. I can go back, let me, whatever it might be, let me shift that color balance. We need the sky to look more purple or more green or, more red or whatever silly thing we might come up with. But the point is that we can fine-tune the adjustments, we can fine-tune the mask, but now we've made our work a little bit easier because we have one mask that's constraining all of that behavior. But wait, it gets even better. Because then you decide that not only do I want all of those adjustments to only affect the sky, I want them to affect the sky in a gradient fashion. Sounds too good to be true, but it's totally true. So I'm going to collapse that layer group just so that we can see things a little bit better. I'm going to add another layer group. I'm going to rename this one Gradient, just so we know which one we're talking about. I'm going to add a layer mask. I'm going to choose my Gradient tool, and I'm going to add a gradient, black to white gradient, that has absolutely no impact on the image whatsoever, yet. Let's take a look at what's going on our layers panel. I'll expand the sky adjustments, like that. There's my adjustments for the sky inside the sky adjustments. Notice how they're below the sky adjustments layer group and they're indented. That means they're inside. When I collapse that layer group with that little spinner, that little triangle, you can see that they hide, they disappear. This gradient layer group with a gradient layer mask attached to it is sitting all by itself. All by itself. Doing nothing. We're going to fix that. So we're going to take our sky adjustments and drag it into our gradient. Now we have 2 completely independent layer masks constraining the behavior of 4 adjustment layers. That's like an 8-fold improvement in efficiency. I made that up because it was 2 and 4 and multiplied them together. But now I can go to this gradient, and let's take the gradient over to one side and the other side and from the bottom and the top, and let's make one of those adjustments even more exaggerated so that you can really very clearly see that our gradient, that our gradient is constraining the adjustment so that it is only affecting in a gradient fashion, but the sky adjustment layer mask is also playing a role. So I can adjust only the sky and adjust the sky in a gradient fashion. You can stack these layer groups like 20 deep, by the way. You don't need to. I've never had to go beyond 2, but it is kind of cool just knowing that someday I'm going to come up with some crazy scheme where I will need maybe even 3 of these stacked together. But again, I can use that layer mask associated with the layer group to greatly improve my efficiency and to give me a little bit more flexibility as well. All right, let's bring things home. Learn to refine masks and to be subtle. The last one's the one I have difficulty with. The subtlety thing, not my strong suit. But let's take a look at what we're talking about. We're going to create a selection of the sky. So I want to apply an adjustment that affects the sky, and it looks like that's a pretty perfect selection, wouldn't you say? Okay, except for this little part of the bird. So we'll subtract that. But now it's totally perfect as long as we don't zoom in. So this is sort of like 2 tips in 1. And the reason that it's 2 tips in 1 is because I said it was top 10, and I'm up to 10. And if it was 2, then it would be at 11, and the math doesn't work out right. But really, it's because these 2 fit together or fight each other, depending on how you want to look at it. You only need one of the 2 at any given moment. Because if your adjustments are really subtle, you probably don't need to worry too much about how accurate the mask is. Not that you can completely ignore it, but you don't have to be as worried. Let's take a look at an example. Let's assume that I want to darken the sky. I'll just use a curves adjustment because it's my favorite. I created a selection of the sky. I added a curves adjustment layer, so now I have an adjustment that is only affecting the sky. And so now, there, right about there. Can you agree that the sky has been darkened? Does it appear to be of exceptional quality? Remember, this is being recorded. Let's try that again. They can cut it together in post, I'm sure. Does it appear to be of exceptional quality?
Yes.
Thank you. Why? Because I tricked you and applied a very subtle adjustment. Was the layer mask, or was the selection that the layer mask was created from, was it really super accurate? No. Was it really of the best quality? No. But if I zoom out or apply very subtle adjustments, the layer mask doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. Now, of course, if we zoom in, might we see, oh, actually, again, this is a JPEG image, it's a low res, so don't expect perfect quality when we zoom in, but that looks pretty good. I'm going to turn off the adjustment and on. I don't see any real problems. Again, when it's a subtle adjustment, you get a little bit of a pass in terms of the accuracy of the mask. Not a total, you can't just be sloppy, but you don't have to be quite as perfect in terms of the accuracy of that layer mask. However, if you're going to apply a strong adjustment, now I like to over-exaggerate the adjustment just because why not? I mean, for our purposes, because we're friends now. But now if I zoom in, yeah, not really buying it. You see that really hard transition between, the bird and the sky? And in fact, I have this sky-colored halo around the feathers because my selection didn't quite go all the way to the bird. Well, that's okay. That's what feathering is for. No pun intended at all. At all. There are 2 ways. Now, you can avoid all this, because where does this sort of thing, this issue become a problem? Fuzzy stuff. Hair, feathers, fur. So just avoid anything with hair, feathers, or fur in your pictures. If you're a portrait photographer, that does make it a little bit tricky when you're advertising your services. But yeah, no hair, feathers, or fur, and now suddenly your layer masks can be really crisp and it's no trouble at all. But in the real world, that becomes a problem. So what might we do? Well, we can go on the properties panel, we can click the little button for the masks, and we can just increase the value for, oh look, well, there we have it. Just increase the value for feather and pretend like that's totally perfect. This is still a really exaggerated adjustment. This is ridiculously strong adjustment. When we bring this back to a more appropriate level, suddenly, I mean, even that, let's turn off the adjustment and back on again. Isn't that amazing? So either be really, really subtle or learn to refine your masks. So this is just feathering. That's just using a softer brush, you might say, because my selection had a crisp edge. It's like painting with a hard-edged brush, and now I've softened it. It's like going back after the fact and kind of blurring that mask. Not even it's like. It is literally blurring the mask, but in a non-destructive way. So remember I said that you don't want to zoom in or you'll see problems. Sometimes if you've zoomed in and it looks good, then you don't want to zoom out again because you'll see bigger problems like up here. Whoa, all right. Now we need a little bit of magic. I'm going to make the adjustment a little bit more exaggerated just because we want to really get a better sense of what's going on here. And then I'm going to click my mask edge button in order to bring up the Refine Mask dialog. Now here, once again, I can feather, so I'll go ahead and increase the value for feathering. I can even shift the edge. This one's huge. Watch this. Look, pay attention. Forget about the chin feathers that are causing us a real big problem. Down below here, you see that little halo effect? No problem. Let's just shift the edge outward or inward. And if we find just the right spot, roughly, right about there-ish, we won't worry about getting it absolutely perfect, but you see the effect there. We can fine-tune that to perfection. Bearing in mind, once again, there's a very strong adjustment. The chin feathers here, still a problem. You see this little paintbrush thing over here? That's basically telling Photoshop we're going to want it to take a closer look at this stuff. We can turn on Smart Radius. We can increase the radius so that it's evaluating a larger area. But at some point, we're going to have to say, look, Photoshop, can you help me out here, please? Just paint over the troubled spots and Shazam. It blends them together. Let's go take a look at the top of the head. That actually worked out pretty well. Let's zoom in just a little bit because we don't want to get carried away here. All right, we'll go ahead and click OK to apply that. And now, let's get back to reality. A more modest adjustment. It could still be a strong adjustment. And you see how that blends in very, very nicely. And again, this is with me trying to do this work while you're all staring at me and making me feel very intimidated. Imagine if I was at home in a very quiet environment with a cup of hot tea and was doing this work. Now I can make the results absolutely perfect. All right? And then you can do virtually anything. But there is a lot to be said, I will underscore, for subtlety, for being subtle, making those adjustments relatively modest. If you want to learn more and see lots of training videos that I produced on Lightroom and Photoshop and photography and all sorts of great stuff at a discounted price, everybody loves a discount, graylearning.com/bhphoto, special offer just for you. Thank you guys very much for joining me today. Hope you learned a lot.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.